In the heart of Zubari, the evenings were always alive. Children played in the dusty streets, women sat in small groups laughing as they shelled groundnuts, and men exchanged stories about the day's work. The air often carried the smell of roasted maize and the sound of drums from a neighbor's radio. To anyone passing through, Zubari looked like a place where peace lived in every corner. But behind the tall walls of one house, silence often turned into storms. Inside lived Akini, a gentle woman with kind eyes, her husband Kunda, and their little daughter Leora. To outsiders they looked like an ordinary family, but the truth was far from ordinary. Akini wore smiles that hid pain, and her voice, once full of laughter, had become soft and careful, as if afraid to disturb the air around her. Kunda's footsteps alone could change the mood of the entire house. And little Leora, though young, had learned to read her mother's eyes, sensing when fear was near. While Zubari glowed with joy outside, the home of Akini was heavy with secrets. It was a house where love had once tried to live, but was now being buried under anger, control, and silence. Akini had once walked into marriage with bright dreams. She believed love would protect her, lift her, and give her a home filled with laughter. When she married Kunda, she thought she had found the man who would stand by her side forever. In the beginning he was charming. He spoke sweet words, made promises under the moonlight, and held her hand like she was the most precious gift in the world. But as the days turned into months, and the months into years, the man she had trusted began to change. Kunda's love grew thinner while his temper grew heavier. He became quick to anger, raising his voice over the smallest things. If the food wasn't warm enough, if the house wasn't arranged exactly as he wanted, his words turned sharp. Soon the words turned into silence, an icy silence that scared Akini more than his shouting. She learned to walk on eggshells, choosing her words carefully, her movements softer, just to keep the peace. But no matter how much she tried, her silence only gave Kunda more power. He began to treat her not as a wife, but as someone who had no voice, no choice, no right to be herself. Akini often looked into the mirror and wondered where the girl full of hope had gone. She saw a woman who smiled in front of neighbors but cried quietly into her pillow at night. She saw a woman who stayed because of her daughter, because little Leora's innocent eyes deserved to see a mother near her bed, even if that mother was broken inside. Each day Akini prayed things would change, that Kunda would soften, that he would remember the love they once shared. But instead his arrogance grew stronger. And every time he looked at her with that coldness in his eyes, Akini felt the chains of her marriage pulling tighter, leaving her breathless, leaving her wondering if love had been nothing more than a dream she once believed in. It was a night that started like any other. The sky outside Zubari was painted with stars, and neighbors could be heard laughing as they finished their evening meals. But inside Akini's house the air was heavy. Kunda had come home in a foul mood. His footsteps were loud, his face already dark with anger. Akini tried to keep her voice calm as she served him food, hoping to avoid the storm she could sense brewing. But Kunda was looking for a fight. He complained about the meal, about the house, about everything she had done that day. His voice rose with every word until it thundered across the room, shaking Akini's heart. At first, she tried to answer softly, but he only grew more furious. The anger in his eyes was like fire, and before she could move away, he grabbed her by the arm. His grip was rough, burning into her skin, and in his rage he dragged her across the floor like she was nothing. Akini cried out, her voice breaking with pain and fear, but the walls only echoed her helplessness back at her. Her wrapper loosened, her knees scraped against the hard floor, and her tears wet the ground as he pulled her without mercy. In that moment Akini felt her soul shatter. She had endured harsh words, cold silences, and cruel looks, but this was a wound deeper than the body. It was a humiliation that pierced her spirit. Her cries filled the house, a sound that no wife should ever make, a sound that cut through the night like a knife. But Kunda did not stop. His anger blinded him to her pain, deafened him to her pleas. And while the outside world of Zubari laughed and celebrated the beauty of life, inside that house was a darkness so deep that only one heart truly heard it, the small, trembling heart of little Leora, who stood silently in the corner, watching her mother being torn apart. In the corner of the dimly lit room, little Leora stood frozen. She was only 10 years old, yet her eyes were seeing things no child should ever have to witness. Her small hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the chair. Her lips pressed tight to stop herself from crying out. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she stayed silent, afraid that if she spoke, her father's anger would turn toward her. Still, her young heart pounded so loudly that she thought it might burst. She wanted to run to her mother, to shield her with her tiny body, but her legs felt too weak to move. Yet, even in that moment of fear, something began to stir deep inside her. She was scared, but she was also angry. Angry that her gentle, loving mother was being treated this way. Angry that the home that should have been filled with laughter had become a place of screams. For the first time, Leora began to understand that silence was not safety, it was a prison. She wiped her tears with her small hands and kept watching, her heart breaking, but also hardening with determination. As she watched her father drag her mother across the floor, Leora felt a new fire inside her chest. It was small like the flicker of a candle, but it was real. She knew she could not fight her father's strength, but she also knew she could not just stand by forever. Something had to change. She promised herself in that moment that she would not let her mother suffer alone. Though she was only a child, she felt the weight of courage pressing on her heart. That night, as her mother's cries echoed in her ears, Leora's childhood innocence was quietly replaced with a strength that would one day shock not just her family, but the whole world. That night, Leora lay on her small mat, her eyes wide open in the darkness. Sleep would not come. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard her mother's voice crying out, the sound of pain and fear echoing in her head. She pulled her thin blanket close, but nothing could block out the memory of what she had seen. Her heart ached, and her little chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. She had seen her father's hands hurting her mother, and the image would not leave her mind. She turned on her side and looked at her mother's sleeping form. Akini had finally drifted off, but even in sleep, her face looked tired and broken. Leora could see the marks on her arms, the way her body curled as if still trying to protect itself. A sharp pain ran through Leora's heart. She wanted to cry out loud, but she bit her lips and swallowed the tears. She didn't want to wake her mother, who had already suffered enough. As she lay there, Leora realized something for the first time. Silence was dangerous. She thought of all the times she had stayed quiet, watching her father shout, slam doors, or throw things. Every time she kept quiet, it only gave him more power. Every time her mother smiled and said nothing, it only made him bolder. Leora understood now. If she stayed silent, her mother would continue to suffer again and again. Her little fists clenched under the blanket. She was just a child, but she felt something growing inside her. A need to act, to break the chain of fear that trapped her mother. She knew it was risky, she knew her father would be angry, but she couldn't hold back anymore. In that quiet night, while the rest of Zubari slept peacefully, a small girl whispered a promise in her heart. She would not let her mother's cries go unheard again. The sun rose over Zubari, painting the sky with soft orange light. Roosters crowed, women swept the compounds, and life moved as if nothing had happened the night before. But inside Leora's heart, the night's memories were still sharp and alive. She watched her father sitting with his friends under the mango tree, laughing loudly as if he were the kindest man in the world. His deep laughter echoed through the compound, but to Leora it felt cruel, almost mocking. How could he laugh when her mother's body still ached, when her spirit was still broken? Her mother, Akini, moved quietly around the house that morning. She spoke little, her voice low, her steps slow. She carried pain in her eyes, but she forced a smile whenever Kunda's gaze fell on her. Leora noticed every detail. She noticed how her mother's hands shook when she poured water, how she quickly pulled down her sleeve to hide the bruises on her arm. To the world, Akini looked like a wife busy with her duties, but to Leora, she was a prisoner hiding her wounds. Something inside the little girl refused to stay quiet anymore. She sat on the edge of the wooden bench, her small legs swinging, and thought carefully. If she waited for another night, the screams would return. If she stayed silent, her mother's tears would never end. She was only 10, but her heart told her that courage had no age. She didn't have the strength to fight her father, but she had a voice, and she had to use it. That morning, Leora made her decision. She would speak. She would reach out. She didn't know exactly how or to whom, but she knew she had to act. She looked at her mother's tired face, and in that moment, she promised herself that no matter what it cost, she would find a way to protect her. It was a secret decision, a brave decision, born in the heart of a child who had already seen too much pain. And once that decision took root, Nothing could stop it from growing. When the school bell rang that morning, children in Zubari rushed through the gates with their books and laughter. But Leora walked slowly, her heart heavy with secrets. Her small hands gripped the straps of her bag tightly, her steps unsteady. She kept looking over her shoulder, afraid her father might somehow be watching. Inside the classroom, she couldn't concentrate. The chalk squeaked on the board. Children recited lessons loudly, but her mind was filled only with her mother's cries. Her chest felt like it was carrying a stone too heavy for her age. During the break, she saw Mama Zuri, her teacher, sitting under the shade of a neem tree correcting books. Mama Zuri was a kind woman, known in Zubari for her soft heart and strong voice when it came to protecting children. Leora's throat tightened as she walked toward her. At first, she wanted to turn back, but then she remembered her mother's bruises, the fear in her eyes, and her father's cruel laughter. With trembling hands, she clutched Mama Zuri's wrapper and whispered, "Mama, I need to tell you something." Her voice broke, and before she could stop herself, the words came pouring out. Between sobs, Leora told her everything, about the shouting, the dragging, the bruises, and the tears that filled their nights. Mama Zuri stopped writing and lifted her head slowly, her eyes wide with shock. She pulled Leora close, letting the child cry into her lap. Pain filled her heart, but so did determination. She stroked the little girl's hair gently and said, "You are very brave for telling me this. You did the right thing." In that moment, Leora felt a small weight lift off her shoulders. For the first time, she wasn't carrying the burden alone. She didn't know what Mama Zuri would do next, but she knew she had finally broken the silence. And in her teacher's strong embrace, she felt the first spark of hope. Mama Zuri could not sit still after hearing Leora's story. Her heart was heavy, and anger burned quietly inside her. She had seen bruises on women before. She had heard whispers in the market, but hearing it from the lips of a child made it impossible to ignore. She knew if she stayed silent, Akini's suffering would continue. That evening, after the children left school, she wrapped her scarf tightly around her head and walked with purpose toward the Women's Council of Zubari. The Women's Council was made up of respected mothers, widows, and grandmothers who carried authority in the community. They were the ones people turned to when homes fell apart or when injustice needed a voice. Mama Zuri stood before them and repeated everything Leora had told her. Her voice shook at first, but soon it grew stronger. The women's faces grew stern, their eyes filling with fire. They were not just listening to a story. They were hearing a cry for help from one of their own daughters. Within hours, word spread among the elders and community leaders. Men who valued justice, women who knew the weight of pain, and neighbors who had once suspected the truth but stayed silent now began to gather. The news moved like wind through Zubari, stirring hearts that had once been quiet. By sunset, a group of strong voices had united, ready to walk together toward Kunda's compound. They were not carrying weapons. They carried something far more powerful: unity, truth, and the courage to protect one of their own. Children followed curiously from a distance, neighbors whispered at their gates, and the air itself seemed heavy with anticipation. The time for silence was over. Behind Kunda's walls, cruelty had hidden for too long. But that night the whole community was preparing to confront it. And at the heart of it all stood Mama Zuri, her voice now louder than fear, holding tightly to the promise she had made to a little girl who dared to speak. That evening, Kunda sat in the center of his compound, leaning back in his chair with pride. He had eaten well, his friends had praised him, and he felt like a man in full control of his home. Akini moved quietly in the background, her steps careful, her face lowered, making sure not to draw his attention. Little Leora sat silently in the corner, her heart beating faster than usual. She knew something was about to happen, but she did not know exactly how it would unfold. As the night breeze rustled through the trees, a sudden knock echoed at the gate. Kunda frowned, surprised at the late visit. Before he could stand, the door pushed open, and people began to file in. Elders in their traditional wrappers, women from the council, neighbors with serious faces. All of them stepped inside. At the front was Mama Zuri, her presence strong, and beside her stood little Leora, her tiny hand gripping the edge of her teacher's wrapper for courage. The compound fell silent. Even the crickets seemed to stop their song. Kunda's prideful smile froze, and his eyes darted from one face to another. He had never expected the community to walk into his home like this. For a moment he tried to puff his chest, to act unbothered, but the weight of so many eyes staring at him made the air heavy. Akini stood still near the doorway, her breath caught in her throat. She looked at her daughter, at the line of strong faces that had entered her home, and tears welled in her eyes. For the first time in years she did not feel completely alone. The silence in the compound was not empty, it was full of questions, full of judgment, full of power. And Kunda, the man who always roared with anger, suddenly found himself cornered by the quiet strength of his entire community. Akini stood near the doorway, her body trembling as the elders and neighbors filled her compound. For a long time she had carried her pain in silence, believing no one would ever step inside to defend her. Her tears began to fall the moment her eyes landed on Leora. Her little girl, only 10 years old, stood bravely beside Mama Zuri, her chin slightly lifted, her eyes steady. In those young eyes, Akini saw something she had thought was gone forever: hope. Her chest tightened as emotions rushed through her. She remembered all the nights she had prayed quietly, whispering to the heavens for strength. She remembered covering her bruises with long sleeves so neighbors wouldn't ask questions, forcing smiles so no one would know the truth. She had thought her pain would remain hidden forever, trapped within the four walls of her home. But now the truth stood in front of everyone, carried by the courage of a child. Akini's tears were not just of sadness. They were tears of release, of a burden finally shared. She looked at her daughter and felt her heart swell with both pride and sorrow. Pride that her little girl had the strength to speak where she could not. Sorrow that it had to be Leora, so young, who carried the weight of protecting her own mother. The community's presence filled the compound with strength, but it was Leora's face that gave Akini the courage she thought she had lost. She realized her daughter was no longer just a child in this moment. She was her voice, her shield, her reason to keep fighting. As the tears streamed down her cheeks, Akini whispered a prayer in her heart. For the first time in years, the darkness in her home was being pierced by light, and that light was shining through the brave, innocent eyes of her little girl. Kunda sat stiffly as the elders surrounded him, their faces hard and filled with disappointment. One of the oldest men stepped forward, his voice deep and sharp as he asked, "Kunda, is this how a man treats the woman who shares his home? Is this the example you want to give your daughter?" The words hit him like stones. For the first time, his laughter and arrogance were gone. He shifted uncomfortably, trying to defend himself. He forced a smile, claiming the neighbors had misunderstood, that Akini was exaggerating, that nothing truly happened. But before he could finish his excuse, a small voice cut through the heavy silence. Leora stepped forward, her tiny hands clenched by her sides. Her voice shook, but her words were clear. "I saw him hurt Mama." The entire compound froze. The elders turned their eyes toward the child, and Akini gasped softly, covering her mouth. The truth, spoken from the lips of a child, carried a weight no one could deny. Kunda's face darkened. For a moment he looked at his daughter, his pride battling with his shame. But the words hung in the air like fire, burning away every lie he had tried to build. The neighbors murmured, some shaking their heads, others glaring at him openly. The women of the council crossed their arms, their eyes like sharp blades. He could no longer hide. His pride, which once made him walk tall in the village, now crumbled before the truth of his own child. For the first time, Kunda lowered his gaze. The man who had once filled his home with anger now sat in silence, cornered not by fists, but by the courage of a little girl. Shame wrapped around him like a chain, heavier than any punishment the community could give. And in that silence, everyone knew the power of truth had spoken louder than all his arrogance. The moment Leora's words filled the air, something shifted in the compound. It was as if her small voice had broken a wall that had kept everyone silent for too long. People looked at one another, their hearts stirred by the courage of a 10-year-old child. For years, some neighbors had heard the shouts from Kunda's house. They had seen Akini's forced smiles, but fear or shame kept them quiet. Now, hearing Leora speak so boldly, their silence could no longer continue. One woman stepped forward, her voice trembling with anger. "I have seen her with bruises," she said, pointing at Akini. "I stayed quiet, but no more." Another man added, "Many nights I heard her cries. I regret not knocking on the door." Soon voices rose one after the other, each confessing what they had seen, each demanding justice. It was as if Leora's truth had lit a fire in their chests. burning away the fear that once chained them. Mama Zuri stood tall, her eyes shining with pride as she placed her hand on Leora's shoulder. "This little girl has shown us what bravery means," she said. "She has spoken the truth without fear. We must not fail her. And we must not fail her mother." Her words echoed and everyone nodded, their faces firm with determination. Kunda sat with his head bowed, the sound of unity crashing down on him like thunder. The same people who once greeted him with respect in the market now stood against him, their voices united with one purpose: to protect Akini and to honor the courage of her daughter. Leora stood silently, her eyes still wet with tears, but her heart beating with new strength. She did not fully understand the power of what she had done, but the community did. They knew her small voice had carried more weight than any elder's speech, more strength than any man's anger. In that moment everyone realized something unforgettable, that sometimes the bravest warriors are not the loudest or the strongest, but the children who dare to tell the truth. The ruling of the community was swift and firm. The elders, together with the Women's Council, made it clear that Kunda could no longer stay in the house he had turned into a place of fear. "A man who cannot protect his family does not deserve to live among them," one elder declared. His words rang loud, and no one dared to challenge them. Kunda, once proud and feared in his home, now stood small and powerless. He was ordered to leave immediately, with nothing but the clothes on his back. The neighbors watched as he walked out of the compound, his steps heavy, his head lowered in shame. For the first time his power had no place within those walls. When the gate finally closed behind him, the air inside the house felt different. It was lighter, softer, as though the walls themselves sighed in relief. Akini stood frozen for a moment, unable to believe what had just happened. Then when her eyes fell on Leora, she broke down, tears streaming down her face. She pulled her daughter into her arms and held her tightly, whispering, "You saved me. You saved us." That night, for the first time in many years, Akini lay down to sleep without fear of heavy footsteps or angry shouts. She wrapped her arms around Leora, who nestled close against her chest. Together they drifted into sleep, their breaths steady and calm. It was not just rest, it was freedom. The silence of the night was no longer filled with dread, but with peace. It was more than the end of suffering. It was the beginning of something new. Akini knew life ahead would not be easy, but with her daughter by her side, she felt a strength she had never known before. The chains that once bound her heart had been broken, not by her own hands, but by the small, brave voice of her child. This was not just survival. It was a turning point, the first page of a new story, one built on courage, love, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. News of what happened in Zubari did not stay within its walls. Word traveled quickly, carried by market women, visiting traders, and travelers passing through. People spoke in hushed voices at first, then in loud admiration. They talked about the little girl who had dared to stand against her father, the child whose courage exposed the darkness that had been hiding inside her own home. Many could not believe it. How could someone so young do what so many adults had been too afraid to do? In nearby villages, mothers held their daughters closer as they told the story. Fathers listened quietly, some feeling shame, others feeling pride that a child could speak such truth. Women who had endured years of silence felt their hearts stir with new courage. They thought of Akini, they thought of Leora, and they began to wonder if they too could break free from their chains. Even in the council meetings, elders mentioned Leora's name. "If a child can speak against injustice," one leader said, "then what excuse do we, the grown, have to remain silent?" His words spread like fire, inspiring many to look closer at their own families and neighbors. It was no longer just about one household, it had become a lesson for everyone. Leora did not fully understand the ripples she had created. She still played with her dolls, still laughed with her friends at school. But wherever she went, people looked at her with respect. Some called her the brave child. Others simply smiled warmly at her mother and whispered blessings under their breath. Her voice had become more than a cry for help. It had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that change can come from the smallest and most unexpected places. In homes where silence once ruled, women and children began to speak. And slowly, in many corners of Zubari and beyond, darkness began to lift, because one little girl dared to let her voice echo.
Years later, whenever people asked Amina how she managed to survive everything she went through, she would pause, smile softly, and say, I didn't fight alone. My daughter fought for me." Those words carried so much truth. Amina knew that without Naledi's courage, she might still have been trapped in silence, carrying her pain in the shadows. Instead, her little girl had stood up in the most powerful way, not just for her mother, but for every woman who had ever been silenced. Naledi's name began to live far beyond Kawanda. Schools told her story, churches spoke about her bravery, and women whispered her name as if it was a shield of strength. People called her the girl who gave her mother a voice, and everywhere she went, she was treated like living proof that even a child could shake the world with truth. Amina and Naledi built a new life together, one filled with laughter, healing, and hope. Their scars remained, but they wore them like medals of survival. And while the world moved on to other news, their story never really faded. It stayed alive in the hearts of mothers and daughters who looked at each other differently after hearing it. It became more than just a moment, it became a legacy. And every time Amina saw Naledi smile, she knew her daughter wasn't just her child, she was her hero. Do you want me to expand this into a longer 350 to 400 word version for even more depth and